Did you know that rural areas constitute 70 to 90% of the land and 15 to 20% of the population in the United States? Rural organizations are a key component of the human and animal welfare system, yet they have historically received substantially less support and less attention than their counterparts in metropolitan areas. Now, fortunately, over the last several years, the plight of rural organizations, it's really started to receive a lot more attention. And the need for rural-focused resources has finally been getting national recognition. And that is one of the reasons why I am here today talking to you. I'm Cole Wakefield, Executive Director of Good Shepherd Humane Society and the founder of and managing advisor of an organization called Rural Humane. Now, Good Shepherd is a small rural humane society based in northwest Arkansas in the Ozark Mountains. We primarily serve Carroll County, which is home to one small tourist village, Eureka Springs, and 3 large poultry processing plants spread throughout the county. Now, Carroll County has a population of around 28,000 people that share 640 square miles. And while Good Shepherd's focus is primarily Carroll County, the lack of services in our neighboring counties, and they are even more isolated than we are, means that we often have to pick up the services and requirements to help those counties too. Now, most of what we're going to talk about today has been learned through practical, in-the-field, rural experience at Good Shepherd and with a lot of other small organizations that I work with around the country. This is a real headline about a real event that actually occurred outside my front gate. And it's from this century. It's not from our Wild West times in Eureka Springs. Now, the whole story here is just a little bit convoluted and way too much for me to get into today. But I wanted to share this headline as an example for all of us, for when things seem to be overwhelming, the same things seem to be impossible, or they just seem to be downright wacky, that doesn't mean that you cannot turn it around and do better. I know that many of you, like all of us right now, are struggling, but there are some proven paths that can help you, and Good Shepherd and others are proof of that. From bankruptcy to shootouts to an investigation by the Sheriff's Department into neglect, all of those are crises that Good Shepherd has gone through in the last 2 decades. I came to Good Shepherd in 2019, and I began implementing a lot of the solutions, or some of the solutions we will talk about today. But the number one way that we have improved what is happening in our outcomes at Good Shepherd is that we have changed the way that we think about our work, and what I hope to help you do today is make that same change. So this is some of the successes that we've seen. In 2018, we accomplished 138 adoptions. In 2024, we did over 700. For community spay and neuter support, in 2018, we were helping out with a roughly couple dozen surgeries in the local community. In 2024, now as a leading spay and neuter provider in our region, we provided thousands of spay and neuter surgeries. For community pet support, in 2018, we had no community pet support program, and we were buying all of our food for the shelter. Last year, we supplied over 100,000 pounds of food to our local food banks and other shelters and rescues in the region. And thanks to that program, I don't buy food for my shelter anymore. It all comes through those. Another great thing we don't always talk about, in 2018, we raised $80,000 from our local community. In 2023, since we started becoming community-focused and turned ourselves away from being an obligation and into being an asset, we raised $168,000 from that same community. Now, how many people did we add, right? I mean, what sort of massive building? Did we build a new building? Did we add a whole bunch of staff? Well, we didn't build a new building. We're still in the same building that was constructed in 1989. And we added 1 full-time position since we've started these programs. So we made all of these changes simply by changing our process and our mindset. and that means that anybody can do it, even those of us without a whole lot of resources. The team running Good Shepherd in 2018, they were really good people, the people who were there before me, and they were trying really hard to do good things. But the problem was they didn't have the training or the guidance or even a really complete understanding of their problems that they were trying to solve. So they spent a lot of their time doing what a lot of us have found ourselves doing, which is just running in circles and not really moving forward very much. But here's the thing. When I started at Good Shepherd, I didn't know much more than they did when I started there. I started at Good Shepherd not too long before I came to my first conference. But I knew that there had to be better ways to do more. So I started my personal learning journey, which involved coming to conferences and talking to people and signing up for every pilot I could find and trying dozens of programs and letting the ones that worked stick around and being okay with it, going ahead and moving on from the ones that didn't work. But the reality is, there's nothing special about me. There's nothing that I've done at Good Shepherd that not anyone else in this room can also do. So here's the basic rundown of what we're going to talk about for the rest of this breakout session. We're going to take a quick look of what rural means, which has turned out to be a way more complicated question than when a lot of us thought. We're also going to learn a little bit about the past, because the past has brought us to where we are today, and without an understanding of it, a better understanding of it, we will all keep repeating the same mistakes. Followed by that, we'll look at the system of animal welfare, which is really where I want to challenge you to change your thinking and how you're approaching your problem solving and your organization. And then we're going to get into some practical, proven practices, along with resources I think you'll find valuable, some grant resources, and some practical resources. So it's going to be a little bit of a ride, but I hope you all stick with me. But before we get into that, there is one thing that I would like to discuss first. I think it's pretty safe to say that most of us in this room are 100% on board with the idea of the no-kill philosophy. After all, we're here with Best Friends, our very gracious host, and they have been, for a long time, one of the leading promoters and proponents of that philosophy. And while we're in a room like this together with a bunch of like-minded individuals and we're going to these sessions, it can feel like that term and that ethos is universally understood and supported. But the reality inside of our industry is not quite that simple. Now, when I say no kill, what I mean is that my organization does not kill animals to create space, and all of our euthanasia decisions are made on an individualized basis that holistically considers the health and well-being of that individual animal along with the safety and security of our community. Now, that's a whole lot to say to somebody, especially if you're trying to get your point across quickly or trying to raise money. So in general, sometimes it can be a lot easier to say, yeah, we're no-kill. But what we need to understand is that if we are going to continue to use no-kill language, we must do so responsibly, with our eyes wide open, and acknowledge the limits and potential harms that have come with its use in the past and its misuse by others. No-kill language can and has been used to build walls between organizations that would benefit from working together. And the emotions around this very powerful and important work that we do, and with that language, has caused real harm to people inside shelters who haven't been able to achieve that status. And there's also cases where people have justified inhumane operations trying to cloak under the term no-kill. So here's the thing. I use that term. Good Shepherd uses that term and is proud to be a no-kill shelter. And if you're operating a responsible, and I want to stress responsible, no-kill model, continue to use the term. However, if you're not technically no-kill, if you haven't quite made it, or for some reason your organization is not comfortable using that language, your work is still just as important and valid as the rest of us. We should all work together to eliminate the killing of any animal that can be safely and responsibly placed in a home. But each organization is on its own journey. Throughout this presentation, I will be using information from various sources, most which promote community-centered approach to our work. This approach, at least in a widespread basis, is relatively new, but it's vitally important. The important thing to remember is that new concepts can sometimes be controversial, and new concepts to a point are all experimental. Sometimes we get it right from the start. Other times, and most times, we have to make adjustments as we go, and that is okay. However, we do know that the system we currently have is overtaxed and largely ineffective at a large scale. Change has to come to our work. All of this is to say, and it goes for any presentation you attend during this conference, if you hear a quote from an organization that maybe you don't quite agree with, or there's a program that didn't work for you, so you don't like it, or if I use terms that you don't really like, or there's a certain part of my presentation that rubs you the wrong way, please don't let that keep you from finding a benefit from this presentation and every presentation you attend to. After all, no matter how much we might disagree in our very emotional, very powerful work, we all still agree on a whole lot more. So another piece of tricky language, one that is way more complex than it initially seems, is the actual word rule. Everyone seems to have an idea of what that word is, but no one can really agree on how to define it. In fact, the federal government itself has over 30 definitions of rule. Almost every agency that touches a rural community has its own definition of what a rural community is. And while rule is often one of those we know it when we see it sort of things, how we see rule can change based upon our own experiences. Now, someone who grew up down the street here in Riverside, California, with a population of over 300,000 people, may very well consider my hometown of Fort Smith, Arkansas, with a paltry 70,000 people, as a rural town. However, anybody who lives within 40 miles of, or 60 miles of Fort Smith is the big city, and they're the rural people. But even like the government definitions don't always get it right. Now, for another example, we look at Berryville, Arkansas, and this is the Census Bureau classifies Berryville as an urban cluster because it has a population of 5,500 people. However, Berryville is about an hour away from any major urban area and doesn't benefit from the traditional government or social services that you see in larger cities, like there's no public transit. Despite Berryville's urban classification from the Census Bureau, you would really struggle to find anybody in that town who would say that they lived in a city or an urban area. So if you're asking me, what is rural, Cole? That's here. You're the expert. You're supposed to be talking about it. I hate to tell you this, I don't really have a good answer. There are some decent approximations, such as the metro, non-metro classification, which was the map I showed at the beginning of the session, but even that misidentifies significant rural areas, especially out west where some of the counties are giant. But the bottom line, if you think you are serving a rural area, then you probably are. So whatever that means for you and whatever that means for your community, if you feel rural, I imagine that you are. So now that we've so suitably not answered that question at all and confused the issue as much as possible, let's talk a little bit about who is in rural areas. Now, for most of us, when we are asked to picture who lives in the rural United States, this is the image that pops into our head. And while, yes, older white farming couples are certainly a strong presence in rural America, the reality is that they are far from representative of who actually lives there. In fact, agricultural jobs make up less than 10% of the rural population's workforce. And many of the jobs that are classified as agriculture work in facilities that are more like factories than they are farms. This is important for us to note that rural America, even though as an aggregate may be 85% white, rural American communities are not universally white. They are home to significant non-white populations, and some of those non-white populations predate the existence of this very country. So we have to not only acknowledge those populations, but be programming for those communities. Let's take example of Green Forest, which is where I live now. It's a tiny town in Carroll County of 3,000 people. I'm one of those people. It's in a county that is 85% white. However, Green Forest itself has a 51% non-white population and a primary language mix that includes English, Spanish, Marshallese, and Karen, which is Singaporean dialect, I believe. Green Forest itself, this tiny rural city in the middle of nowhere, is one of the most diverse cities in the state of Arkansas. So if I want to serve my community truly and effectively, I have to take all of that into account. Otherwise, I will fail at reaching that community and serving that community. So wherever you live and wherever you work, make sure you are taking a good look at who lives in your community and who you are serving, because when you look deep enough, you yourself might be surprised. And I will tell you that most people who live in Carroll County, when I tell them that Green Forest is a majority non-white city, even if they've been there their whole lives, they are surprised to learn that. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Marcus Garvey spoke these words in the context of Black empowerment and history, but his insight applies universally. Understanding our past is essential to bringing a stronger future. In animal welfare, knowing our history helps us learn from mistakes and shape a more effective, compassionate system. For the next few minutes, we're going to take a look at our past, one that we're not that far separated from, so that we can better understand how that past affects us today and how we should be using it to shape our current work. On the screen is an illustration that shows New York City's official method for handling unlicensed and stray dogs. This was during the last half of the 19th century, which, as a reminder, for a lot of us, really wasn't that long ago. It seems like a long time ago, but really in the history, it wasn't that long. During certain times of the year, the city would place a bounty on the dogs, and any member of the public who found a wandering dog without a license or any indication of ownership, they could scoop that dog up, take it to the impound yard, where they would receive a reward. The dog would then be placed into a cage with 50 or so other dogs and thrown into the East River. That was how we killed stray and excess animals not that long ago. And right before they started drowning them in the river, it was simply you could club the dogs you found on the street and take their carcasses and turn them in for a bounty. These roundups, of course, would cause chaos, and the bounties eventually would encourage people to have pet theft because they would take your dog because they could go get the quarter for it. But at that point in time, that was seen as the most effective way to deal with what was a very real public health challenge, and that was significant populations of roaming and packed dogs, which carried all sorts of disease risks, mainly rabies, but other disease risks and risk to livestock, because back then there were a lot of horses on the street. So lots of reasons that they were doing it, but it was seen as this was the only way to do it. Now, during the late decades of the 1800s, the open to any person sort of freelance bounty program started to evolve into a slightly more formal government position. And this would be the government position that was the ancestor to a lot of us in this room, and that is the old dog catcher. These positions were generally contract positions that paid a flat rate for every stray dog killed, which is funny because a lot of us are still working on contracts that pay a flat rate for every stray dog that we bring in. In fact, in some newspapers, the people holding this position were actually called in the paper regularly dog killers, because essentially that was their job, to track down and kill, usually via poison or gunshot, stray dogs. If a dog was found unsecured on the street, it was subject to immediate termination. Newspapers would regularly publish dog killer updates and warnings reminding people to keep watch over their perps, lest the dog killer were to find them. It was not uncommon for pet dogs to fall victim to the dog killer. And these dog killers, they were employed in communities of all sizes throughout the entire country, not just big cities. These were happening in small cities too. And it was not, so people would often only know that the dog killer had come to town because when they would wake up in the morning, in the street would be a bunch of dead dogs. Because it wasn't the dog killer's job to actually pick up the bodies. Their job was simply to kill the dog. Now, one of the most interesting things about reading historical reports in newspapers is that we can actually see the gradual shift in public perception of our work. Early on, starting in the 1870s, as rabies concerns were at the top of mind, the newspaper itself would usually call, "It's time for the dog killer. Let's get the dog killer out here. The dogs are getting out of control." And occasionally, the newspapers would write feature articles praising the effectiveness of their dog-killing team. Around the turn of the century, the attitudes really started to change, though. As people began to openly complain about pets being killed and the cruelty of using poison in firearms, it became, it was like we need a change. It was also around the turn of the century that licensing programs started to take hold. And of course, licensing programs were partially for revenue, but also partially so your dog could have a tag so the dog killer wouldn't pick it up and kill it right away. Newspapers also began suggesting that the dog-killing profession was less than honorable, with accusations that money, not public safety, was driving some to kill, and that the meat of the dead dogs might also be an income source for those officials, and probably a source of meat for whichever minority group was currently the most unpopular at the time. And this change was happening nationally. As societal reform efforts took hold, the status of some animals, and children for that matter, started elevating from mere objects to objects with feelings. As a result, the ASPCA was founded, and in 1866, the humane movement in the United States started to take root, with real progress reaching many Western rural states in the 1920s. The movement, and it is important to our present, and I want to think this is very important to our present, the humane movement was founded with a largely paternalistic ethos and led by wealthy individuals who felt that they could help civilize the lower classes and minorities because that was the only way that they could protect the animals. That's a complicated legacy for sure, but the saviorism and elitism that is at the very foundation of our industry still impacts us today. So that goes all the way back to the beginning. It is still there, and it is something that we all need to be constantly self-reflecting on and making sure that we are avoiding that counterproductive approach. So, thanks primarily to the humane movement, mass drowning in the river and poisoning or gunshots were no longer seen as the primary acceptable way, though I think if we're working in rural areas, most of us still know ACOs or sheriff's deputies who might still use gunshots as a form of euthanasia, which is still legal in many states. But that sort of common practice started getting away, and the humane movement started promoting a new way to handle this problem. We had the gas chamber and decompression chambers would soon become the most popular form, and the first forms of killing that people might start using the term euthanasia on. And these gas chambers and pressure chambers would soon become one of the most popular and preferred forms of killing animals from the shelter. Now, with a gas chamber, in a lot of places, a chamber being a pretty elaborate word for an airtight box, a hose would be hooked up to the exhaust of a truck. The animals would be put into the chamber, and the engine turned on, where we would tell the public that those dogs would just peacefully fade away. Well, we've learned that it's not quite as peaceful of a death. Same thing with the decompression chamber. But the important thing to realize is that decompression chambers and gas chambers weren't some cruel design from a heartless government. They were designed, invented, and promoted by the humane movement, the ancestors to us in this room, because they were seen to be a better way than drowning or shooting. But I think it's crazy that not crazy, but I think it's interesting that we look back today and we gasp at, oh my gosh, what a horrible thing, putting those dogs and cats in there. But that is very much our legacy. But the reality is that after doing that for some time, we realized that there were better ways. And so after decades of promoting decompression in gas chambers, we started promoting euthanasia by injection, which I think most of us will agree is a better solution. But that's important to remember because there are things that we're going to learn today here at this conference, and there are solutions that we are all out there promoting because we honestly think it is the best possible way to handle this problem, that 20 years from now, somebody might look back at us and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. But that's okay, because that is how we evolve into who we are today. But thanks to those reforms, shelters were built, and at least a basic idea of some sort of basic care became expected by the public, as did the idea of giving owners time to reclaim lost pets before they were killed. And it's that basic system, it's that basic system with roots in the late 1800s, better developed in the 1920s and 30s, that we essentially operate from today. That is the basis of everything we do. We've been doing it for 100 years, and the most remarkable thing is that in 100 years, the headlines have not really changed. Think about that. The headlines, the problems, the quotes, the complaints today are basically the same as they were in a century. And I don't mean to discount the amazing progress that we have made, right? So it wasn't that long ago, 3 million, 10 million animals were being euthanized every year. Amazing strides forward that we should celebrate, that we're not doing anymore. But the reality is that we still haven't addressed the base cause of what the problem is. So we've grown in our understanding of animals and how to safely and humanely house them. Our euthanasia methods are much more humane, and we've adopted professional standards and trainings like this conference, but we haven't solved the problem. If we don't change how we do what we do, and we do not start approaching our work in a holistic way, in another 100 years, there'll be some jerk in a funny hat standing in front of another conference saying this same thing. So this next section is we're going to talk about the system of animal welfare, and this is where we talk about approaching how we're looking at it differently. And even if you are in a small one-person agency, you need to view yourself not only as your agency as a system in itself, but as a system that is a part of a system that is a part of a system. Because that approach is how we actually solve these problems. And I promise, I know this is all crazy and heady maybe, but it's worth it, and I really hope that you're able to take something from it. If we wish to build an effective, sustainable organization that can actually solve the problems, we must develop a systems understanding of our work and its impacts. Over the next few slides, we're going to take a brief look into systems thinking and the system of animal welfare and how we can apply that to developing solutions at our small organizations. So what is a system anyway? A system is a collection of interconnected parts that work together to achieve a purpose. These parts, whether they are people, organizations, animals, processes, or policies, none of these parts are isolated. They interact with and they influence each other, often in very complex ways. Systems do not necessarily have to be formally designed or designated. Inside the animal shelter, we have a lot of systems. All of these systems are impacting each other and the shelter as a whole. We have an intake system, you have a placement system, a foster system, a veterinary care system, a cleaning system, a feeding system, and more. Even if you are one person operating your agency, all of those systems, and you may be the key part of it, are existing inside of your agency. And those systems come together to form your shelter or your agency, which is then in turn part of a wider community services system and also possibly part of the law enforcement system and part of your community health system and so on. None of these operate in isolation. Even if you're not talking to the other parts, they're affecting you and you are affecting them. A system is much more than the sum of its parts. Changing one component can have ripple effects throughout the entire system, sometimes in ways that is very difficult for us to predict, which is sometimes why our solutions don't quite work how we intend them to. Understanding these relationships is key to making effective, sustainable improvements. Systems thinking is an approach to problem solving that looks beyond isolated events and individual components to understand the whole picture. And out of everything I share with you today, I hope it's an understanding of this system that you take back with you. So we don't want to just simply focus on one single factor like shelter capacity or intake. We want to think about how all of these affect each other. Let's take a look at a system that we work with. Now, on this screen is a systems map of part of the animal welfare and sheltering system. The important thing to note about systems maps is that if we were to attempt to map every possible point, it would be next to impossible to do so. So the systems map is not intended to be necessarily a comprehensive look every time, but more of a general look to help us understand how the different parts of the system work together. This map contains an example of a couple of the most critical feedback loops that we deal with. A feedback loop occurs when the output of a system influences its own future behavior. There are two primary types of feedback loops. You have reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops. A reinforcing feedback loop amplifies or accelerates changes in the system, leading to growth or decline. For example, you deposit money in your savings account, that money earns interest, that interest gets transferred back into the balance, so next time you actually earn more interest and more interest and more interest. A balancing feedback loop is a stabilizing system, which is more like the temperature in the room in a thermostat. You want to raise your temperature to 72 degrees, you put your thermostat to 72, the heater kicks on, it reaches 72, heater kicks off, and eventually the system's balanced, and then as it goes back down, it kicks back on. So identifying feedback loops is important to us when we're trying to figure out how we're working inside of the system, because they can tell us the difference between systemic problems that can sometimes become exponential, our solutions, versus just when we're simply addressing symptoms. So it's like developing solutions instead of developing Band-Aids. Now let's take a look at the feedback loops in this system. And again, this is a little bit simplified, but I think a generally accurate representation. At the top of the chart, we have the reinforcing feedback loop identified as the reproduction loop. So breeding and reproduction leads to a larger stray population, which will lead to more reproduction, which leads to more strays, which leads to more reproduction, which leads to more strays, and so on. That is a reinforcing feedback loop. The stray population directly influences our intake rate, which is there at the bottom of the loop. Oops, sorry. So yeah, I apologize. The stray population directly influences our intake rate, which is also influenced by surrenders, which is likewise influenced by breeding and reproduction. So as we move down that chart, all of the above increases and puts pressure on our shelter populations, and that directly leads us to our next feedback loop, where more animals in the shelter can lead to more euthanasia, and euthanasia or shelter killing leads to negative public perception, which leads to a decrease in community supports, which leads to a decrease in shelter resources, which results in a decreased shelter capacity, which further increases your death rate, which then continues that loop on. And these are probably loops that all of us have, at some point, at least if you've been in an organization that's been around for a while, have found yourself stuck in. So what does this map tell us? It gives us some options to influence euthanasia rates, but the most sustainable way is to reduce the shelter population, which is driven by the reproduction loop, which means spay and neuter, right? So from a systems perspective, the most effective way that we can reduce shelter populations and interrupt the euthanasia loop is by focusing on reducing breeding and reproduction. The reality is that while there are things that we can do inside of a shelter to better improve our operations, the feedback loops that are dramatically impacting us are happening outside of the shelter. And that's where solutions like spay and neuter can come in. Because remember, that feedback loop works in both directions. Less reproduction means less reproduction, which leads to less reproduction. So with spay and neuter, in a solution like that, we're able to leverage that feedback loop to our advantage. And that is one way, by looking at an entire system, we may be able to find more effective solutions. Now let's take a closer look at how external forces beyond our control impact intake and how they impact each other, especially during times of economic uncertainty, in a way that and this is a way that we can amplify our life-saving, these amplify our life-saving challenges. This systems map, which is a little simplified for presentation, shows the top 5 reasons people surrender to the shelter. Now, for pretty obvious reasons, we know why people surrender, but we don't really know why dogs end up being abandoned on the street because we don't have a way to collect that data. But we can assume that there is some correlation between surrender reasons and abandonment reasons. So we can expect that when surrenders increase, we will probably also see an increase in abandonment or strays. So that by addressing the core reasons for surrender, we can also address core stray issues and abandonment issues. Now, taking a look at this map, we have the top reasons that people surrender to shelters, along with some of the drivers for those reasons. The top reasons there are in yellow. They're representing the flow of dogs and cats into our stock in shelters, which is in blue. In green, we have external variables that impact our flows. So what do we see here? What does all this mean for us, and why do we need to know this? Well, we notice that these issues around surrender are much more dynamic than just seeing them in a top 5 list, right? We've all seen the emails, here are your top 5 reasons to surrender, or this is why animals are coming into your shelter. And that list is very flat. By looking at it here, we can better understand not only what those top 5 reasons are, but what impacts those reasons. And what we notice is that quickly we have 3 main issues, which is health, finances, and housing, that are all really tangled up with each other and tangled up with some really complex things there. But on the other side, on the right side of this chart, we have the 2 other main issues, which is too many pets in the home, are overwhelmed with care, and behavior problems. These 2 issues aren't quite as tangled up as everything else. So what does this mean to us? This means that the right side flows, too many pets and behavior problems that feed directly into intake demand, are for us a more immediately addressable through things like spay-neuter programs, education, community outreach, and training. Meanwhile, the left side flows, they are deeply interconnected with economic forces way outside of our control, and they are going to be much harder for us to resolve without being a part of a much broader systemic intervention. So addressing the right side flows can help mitigate intake demand in the short term, but long-term stability depends on tackling root economic causes. The reality is that addressing and building sustainable reductions in right side flows is more immediately achievable for most organizations, especially organizations like ours with limited resources. So if you only have the resources and the time to address certain intake diversion programs, the ones on the right side where you don't also have to fix your economy are going to be a lot easier for you to make those quick, effective changes. It doesn't mean that we ignore the left side, but we need to understand the complexities that will make it harder, especially for limited resource organizations, to have a long-term sustainable impact there. But we can't forget about them either, so we still have to address them. I mean, the short and sweet thing is that there is no single answer, and that none of our problems, especially those on the left side, can be addressed in isolation. All of this is important because we deal with finite resources, and we have to make decisions to be the most effective as we can with what we have. But don't give up on the other stuff either. Just, So what we've looked at quickly today is one small part of an extremely complex system that we are all responsible for. I hope it just kind of helps you understand how interconnected we are in our work, that as much as we want to label ourselves as siloed or complained about being siloed, it doesn't matter how siloed we make ourselves. It doesn't matter how much we talk to or don't talk to somebody else. We are just as affected by those other organizations and by the system as a whole, either way. So we might as well participate in it and try to get it to start working with us. And if you want to learn more about systems mapping and want to see some more of my systems maps and stuff, I will be at the hub later at the poster presentation, and I'll be happy to just bore you to death with it. One last thing on systems. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. A system can only produce the results that it was designed to produce. Now, those results may not be what we intended for the system to produce, but they are in fact the system that we have designed. If we want different results, we have to change and not just blame the system. So let's talk about some ways that you can change your system to hopefully get the results that you desire. This next one is one that is, I put it in all my presentations because I think it is one of the most important things that you can do as a foundational change, especially in a small community, and that is open up your adoption processes. The reality is system changes do not have to be big to have gigantic effects, and that's the beauty of feedback loops. One of the easiest yet most impactful changes is adopting to your community. In reality, we sometimes see the worst. Coming into our shelters, or if we're out in the field, we see some horrible things, and we see some situations that we can't understand. And what that can do is get us really down on the people in our community, because that's who we are seeing, and in our mind, that's who our community is. How many of us have said, I don't want to adopt the people in this town, they don't love dogs and cats. Yet enough of them are there that you exist, and you're there, and you love dogs and cats, and if you live in a community that absolutely does not love animals, move, because they're murderers. The reality is that most people, by far, in every community, even your community, even where you're seeing the worst stuff, are good people who want to do good things, who love dogs and cats. So it's important to remember, too, that open adoptions doesn't mean that we're just handing out dogs and cats to, walking down the street, we're like Oprah and giving everybody, you get a dog, you get a dog, you get a dog. What it means is that we are letting people who are coming to us looking for companionship, we're going to give that to them unless they give us a really good reason not to. But what we do, and how do we do that? We eliminate our 3-page applications, which honestly have no impact on the outcome of the adoption anyway, and are just a lot of extra work for you. And we replace that with a conversational interview that will generally surface concerns a lot more effectively than the application will. And the matter of the fact is, people are less likely to lie in person than they are on paper. So if you're truly wanting to get an accurate understanding of the people that you are trying to adopt to, stop asking for their background checks, stop asking for their employment history, don't worry about calling their vet, have a conversation, and you will learn so much more. Adoptions also create vital links to your community. Good Shepherd's greatest supporters, and some of the ones who really drove those donation numbers up for us, and most active volunteers, started out as adopters. Now, not every community will be able to absorb their excess populations and rely on adoptions 100%. But if you are able to eliminate pointless barriers, and I promise you, the data's out there. All those barriers you have are pointless. They're not working. They're not helping you. They may make you feel better, but they do not have an impact on the quality of adoptions. And opening up adoptions does not increase negative outcomes. But you will be but if you open those adoptions up and you directly and actively engage your community, you will be surprised at the results that you get. Good Shepherd, as you saw before, has increased the raw numbers of live outcomes by over 300% simply by opening up our adoption process. We've done this for 5 years. We have seen no increase in our return rate, and we have seen no substantial issues or more issues with bad adoptions or other issues. We have been able to cut our reliance on transport by 95%, and we have greatly improved our connection with our community. Opening up adoptions directly led to our ability to enhance our spay and neuter programs and offer other support. It is literally the foundation of everything else that we have been able to do. Now, performing adoptions in rural communities is important for another reason. The people in your area, whether you like them or not, they're going to get dogs and cats. No matter how much we would like to be the lords of pet ownership for our little areas, we're not. The people, if they want a dog or a cat, they're going to get one. And then you won't get them one, they'll get one from a breeder, and then we'll be mad at them for getting one from a breeder. Or they'll go to the Walmart parking lot. Or they can get one from you. When they adopt from you, from an animal welfare agency, we can make sure that they are getting a spayed and neutered animal that has at least its first round of vaccines and a microchip. This will help you build a community of altered vaccinated animals and improve that spay and neuter part of the loop and ultimately reduce the number of animals coming into your shelter. So now we're going to get ready to the really fun part. This is what you put up with all my preaching and lecturing for. This is where we're going to talk about some resources that will help you do your work. I have a bunch of QR codes coming up, so if you want to, you get your phones out, take pictures, and I believe the Best Friends team tested all the QR codes, so they should work. This first one here is the Fear-Free Shelters program. I recommend this for every shelter, large and small. It is an amazing animal handling course provided by Fear-Free. And it's all about handling your sheltered animals by reducing fear, anxiety, and stress. It's a 5-hour course. Fear-Free gives it to you free as a shelter. It is the base training for everybody who works for me at Good Shepherd. Everybody goes through it. Maddie's Pet Forum and Maddie's University are two incredible resources. These are two behavior courses for helping you do behavior work in a shelter. Behavior work is so neglected because it is complicated, but it doesn't have to be that complicated, and you should be doing some sort of behavioral work. And also make sure you're checking out Maddie's Pet Forum while you're there. You'll want to look up the ASV standards. If you're trying to figure out how big should my kennels be, what should I be doing to clean, what is the basic just needs for the animals in my shelter. The Association of Shelter Veterinarians, if you go to their website, I think it's sheltervet.org, you can find their standards. Do your best to adhere to them. Your facility may not allow you to do everything that the standards recommend, but do what you can, and it'll really help you get a baseline, and it can give you some support if you're looking for more money or you're looking for in putting those things together. Human Animal Support Services, HOS program, has an amazing workbook with tons of community-focused programming ideas and ways to do it. It's a huge thing, but they have a little guide that you can take a test to get you what you need to do, but take a look at that. A lot of the programs that we implemented at Good Shepherd have come through that HOS program. Now we're going to talk about money real quick. TechSoup. TechSoup is amazing. If you're a nonprofit, you can get like Wi-Fi hotspots for $150 a year, 5G Wi-Fi hotspots for your remote operations, or even if you're primary. Tons of technology, tons of free and discounted software. Get your TechSoup membership. It's free to join. You will find things that you will need and use, and you will find them at a significant discount there. Canva, you got to do marketing, social media, any of that. If you're not on Canva, nonprofits have free professional memberships for Canva. Take a picture, sign up with Canva. It is amazing. It makes me look like I know what I'm doing sometimes. Google Ad Grants. Google will give you up to $10,000 a month in free search ads. All you got to do is sign up for it, qualify through their program, and it's amazing. We're there. You can set it and forget it. If you have somebody who's a little more technical, get them on it, but it's up to $10,000 a month in free ads. Good 360, another great program for getting super cheap and donated supplies from gloves, boots, toys, anything you can think of. They work with partners there, all new. If you want grants, Petco Love is an amazing resource for grants. Even if you don't have a Petco in your community, if you fill out their annual reporting form, they're going to send you a cash grant every year, unrestricted. I get $4,000 to $6,000 from them a year just because I fill out their form. It's a great program, and if you're looking at doing vaccines, they have an amazing vaccine program, so check out Petco Love. PetSmart Charities also has some great programs. Get there. And I will say, I think almost all of these funders are here. Go talk to them. Go meet the people, go meet your representatives and talk to them. Pet Finder Foundation has dozens of small grants that are easy to apply for and anybody can get. If you're a small shelter and you're trying to get your first grant, this is a great place to start. All you have to do is make sure that you're listed on Pet Finder. And then this is another resource. This is the Humane Pro grant guide that'll list a bunch of other grants. Do it, take it. Don't be intimidated about applying for grants. Get in there, apply for them. Sorry, I'm almost out of time. Walmart.org. Every Walmart gives out money. They can give up to $5,000. All you have to do is sign up for Walmart.org and put in for it. But what I would recommend is that before you do that, wherever your local store is, go meet the general manager. Introduce yourself to them and say, hey, I'm going to be applying for a community grant. And you'll be surprised. You may walk away with $2,000 or $3,000 right there. You have a Walmart, I promise. And you're here at Best Friends, so make sure you're meeting your network reps, your strategists in your area. They can connect you to regional specific resources. They're here, time's up. Together, we can do all of this. And one last thing I have to ask you all is if you will take this survey. This is the first national survey of rural humane societies and rural shelters and rural rescues. We need as many surveys as we can because we're really trying to help our national organizations understand what we need in rural areas. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have time for questions, but you guys can just track me down at anywhere in the conference. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.